Expansion, conquering the Middle East, or how Islam spread out of Arabia. Now, let's go back to where we were last week. In later legends, the Emperor Heraclius had a dream. And in his dream, he saw that his empire would be destroyed by a circumcised people. Terrified by this thought, he assumed that there was a Jewish plot that would bring down the Roman Empire. So, on May 31st, 632, he ordered that all the Jews throughout the empire be either baptized or killed so they would not be a threat. And while he was, according to the story, in the process of spreading this message, a messenger approached. Messenger sent by Muhammad in Arabia to bring the good news of the new revelation to the Roman emperor. And having heard the message, Heraclius asked on a hunch if the emissary would lift up his robe. And when he did, Heraclius saw that the man was, in fact, circumcised. And he asked, "Are all the men of Arabia circumcised?" And he was told that yes, they were. And he realized in despair what was going to happen. Now, this is just a legend, and it's a legend that only makes sense in the time after everything had happened. But it has a basis in reality. There really was a persecution of Jews, and just at this time, things were going to change. Even before Muhammad had died, in June of 632, Muslims had raided into the territory of Syria and Palestine. A little bit later, in 634, a full-on invasion begins, led by a man named Khalid ibn al-Walid. Many of the major cities throughout Syria and Palestine will surrender when the Arabs arrive and will only give a very token resistance. However, there is still a very strong and very active Byzantine military presence. And the Byzantine army gathers and it calls up its Arab allies from the tribal confederation of Abu Ghassan. And they meet the Muslims along the valley of the Yarmouk River, which is a major tributary of the Jordan. It forms actually the border between Jordan and Syria right now. And the two armies meet and they battle for 6 days. And near the end of the battle, the Arab allies of the Byzantines switch sides and join the Muslims. And the Byzantine army is almost completely destroyed. The remnants of the army withdraw northwards across Syria, while the Muslims approach the city of Damascus and accepted surrender almost immediately. Heraclius orders all Byzantine forces to withdraw from Syria and Palestine, letting the Muslims take over. Most of the cities surrender almost immediately when the Arab armies arrive, usually sending out a delegation of religious and business leaders. City of Jerusalem, though, it's a little different. The leader of the Christian church in Jerusalem, the Patriarch Sophronius, says he will only surrender the holy city of the Christians to the Muslims if the Muslims' leader comes in person. Now, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, has died. It's now the second caliph, Omar al-Faruq, and Omar comes up to Jerusalem to meet with Sophronius. The only other city that takes any time will be the city of Caesarea on the coast, and that city will only surrender after it is basically completely destroyed. That won't be for another 2 years. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Omar arrives, and Sophronius leads him around the city, shows him all of the sights, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, uh, built on the site where Jesus is thought to have been buried before he was resurrected. Sophronius takes him through the church, and while they are in the church, it comes time to pray. Sophronius tells Omar, go ahead and pray here. Omar says, no, if I pray in your church, my followers will insist that it is now a Muslim space. So he leaves the church, goes across the street, and prays in the square. Across the square from the front entrance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the older mosques in existence, the Mosque of Omar, where, in fact, a mosque was built on the site where Muhammad first prayed in Jerusalem. Now, after having accepted the surrender of Jerusalem, Sophronius works out arrangements for continued existence of the city. He hands over custody of the Temple Mount, that is the ruins of the former Jewish temple, for that area to be an area for the Muslims. And there, the Muslims will build their very first mosque in Jerusalem. They build it out of wood. The site they build it on is, at the time it becomes Muslim property, an area that is being used as the municipal garbage dump. So, from Sophronius's point of view, they're really not giving the Muslims a lot of land in the city. Much later, of course, that mosque will be replaced by one of stone that still stands, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and across the plaza from it will be built the Dome of the Rock, two of the most famous Islamic buildings in the world. Now, they also work out the relations between Christians and Jews, and the arrangement they make will become sort of the blueprint for what will follow. Jews are now allowed to live in Jerusalem legally alongside Christians and Muslims for the first time. It's actually, since the Roman conquest, other than in the brief period when the Persians have been in control, the first time since the year 70 that Jews can legally reside in Jerusalem. Both Jews and Christians will be expected to pay a tax called jizya, and to accept Muslim rule and not fight against it. In return, they will be protected so long as they obey the laws of the community, and will have no interference in the internal affairs of their religious groups. Now, while Syria and Palestine are being conquered, the Muslims are also attacking the Persian Empire. And there they are also seeking initially to dominate over the Arab tribes that live on the fringe of the desert in the western part of Iraq. Of course, that will bring them into Mesopotamia and into conflict with the much larger Persian army. And there are a series of battles, the Battle of the Chain, the Battle of Al-Anbar, and Al-Walija, that the Arabs will win. The Battle of the Chain is called that because, according to tradition, The Persian soldiers were chained together so that they would not run away, which does not really speak highly of their army. Finally, there is the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, and afterwards, the Muslims enter Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persian Empire. Ctesiphon is located on the Tigris, and its sister city, Seleucia, on the other side of the river, are probably together about 500,000 people, making it one of the biggest cities in the world. When it falls, the Persian Empire has taken a significant blow that it will not be able to recover from. The Arabs will follow the capture of Ctesiphon with campaigns into the heart of Iran, and over the next 15 years will slowly conquer the entire Persian Empire. As early as 643, they have reached the northern frontier of the Persian Empire. This site, the fortress of Derbent, which is just north of the Caucasus Mountains in the very most southern part of Russia today, which is still quite a long way from Mecca and Medina. Now, the Persian Empire crumbles quite rapidly because after their defeat by Heraclius in 628, they had basically collapsed into civil war. In fact, in the immediate years between the defeat by the Byzantines and the invasion by the Arabs, there's something like 12 different emperors in about 4 years. They are very rapid in succession, and there is a constant amount of fighting between Persian armies, which makes them very weak when the Muslims arrive. Now, the very last Persian emperor is a man named Yazdegerd III. He is the grandson of Khusrau. And he escapes from Ctesiphon and moves steadily eastwards across Iran, pursued by the Arabs, his empire steadily shrinking, till finally he dies in 651. At that point, it seems like he was already trying to escape to China to raise another army. His daughters are taken prisoner. One of them will marry Hussein, the son of Ali, the grandson of Muhammad. Another daughter will marry the Jewish exiliarch, a man who claims to be a descendant of King David and rules over the Jewish community in Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, their brother does escape and makes it to China, where he will run a Persian government in exile in Western China, with the goal of convincing the Chinese to lend him an army to restore his family's possessions. His son will be a Chinese general in the south of what's China, and after that, we lose track of that branch of the family. Of the branch descended from Yazdegerd's daughters, well, there are a great many people who claim to be descendants of Hussein ibn Ali, including Ayatollah Khomeini and possibly the British royal family. So people don't always disappear. Now, in the former Persian Empire, the Arabs established garrison towns on the edge of the desert at new sites. One, which will become the city of Basra, the very southern end of Iraq. Today, it's the chief port of Iraq, and at Kufa on the desert edge. There will be other Arab settlements in the territory of Khorasan, which is the north eastern corner of Iran, going over into Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. Iraq itself will be Arabized. The language becomes Arabic for the majority of people there within the next few centuries. In Iran itself, Persian will remain the dominant language, but it is a new type of Persian written in the Arabic alphabet with about a third of its vocabulary borrowed from Arabic. The Zoroastrian religion is going to suffer greatly. In the territory of Syria and Palestine, even several hundred years later, 500 years after the Muslim conquest, probably about 75% of the population was still Christian. In some areas, like in what's now Lebanon, on Mount Lebanon, even now, it's a majority Christian area. Zoroastrianism, though, declines much, much faster. Zoroastrianism had been, of course, the official religion of the old empire, but it struggles now. Unlike Christianity and Judaism, it is not recognized as a legitimate religion by the Muslims, and it had suffered two blows. One, the massive defeat by the Christians under Heraclius, followed by the defeat by the Muslims almost immediately afterwards. And it will fade from a religion of millions of people to a religion of about 120,000 people. It basically fades from being a global religion to being a footnote. Now, having conquered the Persian or Iraq and Syria, the Muslims also turned their eyes westward. And in 639, a Muslim general named Amr ibn al-As decides to set out for Egypt with 4,000 warriors. He is told by Omar not to do it because he does not have enough forces to conquer Egypt. And that might have been true. However, the warriors who follow him have not had the opportunity to profit like their cohorts who have conquered Syria and Iraq have. So they're eager to go. They cross into Egypt. At one point, as they neared the border, Amr becomes aware that there is a messenger riding hard from Omar towards him, and he knows that the messenger is probably going to tell him, don't invade Egypt. So Amr charges into Egypt and invades Egypt. So when he gets the message, like, it's too late, I've already started the war. There is more resistance in northern Egypt than in Syria to the conquerors, but it still moves pretty rapidly. The main opposition is at the Roman fortress of Babylon, which is not the Babylon in Mesopotamia, it just has the same name. It is, in fact, at the point where the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley meet. Across the river from Babylon, the Muslims established their camp, made up of tents Fustat in Arabic, which will become the site of the garrison city of Fustat. Fustat is today an inner suburb of Cairo. Now, Alexandria, the chief port of Egypt, holds out a little longer, but it too surrenders in 641. Egypt is now permanently lost to the Byzantine Empire. Egypt, of course, is the wealthiest part of the Byzantine Empire and the main source of revenue to fund everything else. So with its loss, there are major problems. And with its loss, the Muslims are now in control of the wealthiest parts of both the Roman and Persian empires. They control Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. They are expanding across Iran as the 640s go on. In Constantinople, there is an attempt to figure out why this has happened. And there will be trials of a man named Maximus the Confessor, who is the head of the church in Carthage, and Pope Martin, the head of the church in Rome. They are both put on trial for heresy, for disagreeing with the emperor, and will be accused of aiding and abetting the Muslims. The Pope is said to have written a book that he gave to the Muslims about religion, and is said to have encouraged Amr to invade and conquer Egypt. They are also said to have told the army of Africa to refuse to defend Egypt and stay away from helping the Romans in Egypt to fight off the Muslim invasion. Whether or not that's true, it is kind of interesting that even in the 640s, the Byzantines are trying to figure out whose fault it is. Now, in Syria and Egypt, after the Muslim conquest has happened, there's not a lot of change for most people. There's a book out called The Invisible Conquest, because it isn't immediately obvious that anything has changed. There are new rulers. There are changes in tax policy. But generally, the economies take off in both regions. The city of Damascus will become, in the 660s, the capital of the Muslim Empire under Muawiyah, and that empire will stretch from the borders of China to the Atlantic, leading Damascus into its golden age. Jews and Christians who were not of the official religion of the empire find it to be a really great time. Those Jews who were supposed to have been wiped out by Heraclius come back and return to their old faith. They appreciate the fact that the Muslims have saved them. Christians who do not agree with the emperor are free to practice their religion. Slowly, the culture becomes more and more Arabic in language, more Muslim in religion, but it is a very, very slow process. Estimate is Egypt became majority Muslim around 1400, and only around that time did Arabic finally become the main language throughout the country. It is a very, very slow, gradual process. In between, you have buildings like this one, the Great Mosque of Damascus, which is built using a lot of Byzantine architecture and art. Now, similar process happens in Iraq and Iran. There, the Arabs live in their garrison towns, and there are more converts who are not Arabs, who become Muslim, who will demand more from the government. They will generally support the family of Muhammad as caliph against the Umayyad family, and there'll be a number of rebellions and conflicts between Sunni and Shia based in southern Iraq in that first century of Islam. Now, the new rulers are not very interested in converting non-Arabs to Islam. However, many people still become Muslim. And the reason they're not terribly interested is that they tax non-Muslims with what is called the jizya, a poll tax. It is a relatively low tax, but every non-Muslim has to pay it. And the total tax burden is lower than it had been under either the Persian or Roman Empire. In return for paying this tax, Jews and Christians are given religious tolerance and freedom to practice their own faiths as they would like. So, we look at the blame game, and we wouldn't think it's because, God was angry at the Byzantine Empire for not quite getting it right on theology, which is what the Byzantines would have said. Instead, we can look at the fact that the conflict with the Persians had seriously weakened the Byzantine Empire. The war had been devastating, and they had really not had time to recover. If Muhammad had come along 30 years earlier or 30 years later, it's doubtful that the Muslims would have been able to conquer so much territory so quickly. The Muslims were also able to take advantage of all the religious tensions within the Byzantine Empire, the tensions between Jews and Christians, between the various Christian groups, the Orthodox and the Monophysites, the monotheistic sect, and so on. And the fact that the Byzantines had not recovered from all of these conflicts, even when they were ended. What it means for the Byzantines is that by the end of the 7th century, they lost all of their African and Syrian territories. They would look like they were about to lose everything else. Outside Constantinople, most of the cities of the Byzantine Empire disappear almost completely. Constantinople itself is going to shrink by about 90% in the time between Justinian I and Justinian II, 150 years later. In these years, the Senate finally disappears, the last consuls disappear, the tradition of classicizing history, continuous tradition going from the time of Herodotus through Procopius, right up to the beginning of the 7th century, disappears. Secular education, that is, education outside the church, disappears. What is left of the Byzantine Empire is poorer, much less sophisticated, far less of a great power than it had been. Meanwhile, the Muslims prospered. The mutual exhaustion of Persians and Byzantines has made it possible for them to get stronger. They have a very strong sense of who they are and what they stand for. And the fact that the Muslims thought the end of the world was at hand, the Christians thought the end of the world was at hand, the Jews thought the end of the world was at hand, and the Zoroastrians thought the end of the world was at hand, set everyone up to expect this amazing change in history So when a change in history came, it was much easier to go through. For many people living in the Byzantine and Persian empires, the Muslims offered a much better alternative than what they had been living under. Um, and as a result, in about a century, the Muslims will build an empire that goes from China to the Atlantic. In that territory, their language, their culture, and their religion will come to dominate. In the next bit, I will talk about how they expand out of that core Middle Eastern area to the territory beyond and how that process is somewhat different.